In the last section, we got a high-level overview of how OAuth is going to be working inside of our application. At this point, I want to start to talk a little bit more about how we're going to approach this problem. So we are going to be using a helper library called Passport.js to help us create this authentication flow. In particular, the Passport library is going to automatically take care of a couple different steps inside of here that's going to make our lives just a little bit easier. To make sure that it's clear exactly what Passport's going to be doing for us, I made a little change to this diagram. So let's take a glance at it. Okay, so very clearly, everything inside this yellow box right here, this is essentially what Passport is going to be automating for us, or what it's going to be kind of helping us pull off without us having to write a lot of boilerplate code. Now, before we just kind of dive right in and make use of Passport, there's two big issues around it that I want to tell you about right now at the very get-go. Now, the reason I'm telling you about these two issues around Passport is that they are very common complaints that I hear about Passport all the time. So I'm going to tell you about these two very common complaints so that if we start making use of Passport and you're sitting there thinking like, man, this Passport stuff is just garbage, I want you to be really aware that you probably are voicing a complaint that many other people have as well, okay? So here's the two big things that Passport doesn't quite do so well. First off, Passport does help us automate this entire OAuth flow, but the issue is that it does require us to kind of reach in to some very specific points in the flow, like let's just imagine like right here, and right here, and right here. It requires us to reach in and add a little bit of code to make those steps work nicely. So in other words, it automates vast majorities of the OAuth flow, but not the entire thing. The reason that's a problem is that sometimes when you're setting up OAuth, you get the feeling that you don't really understand the overall big picture. And it feels like you're just kind of adding in some weird code in some weird places without having a good understanding of how it all fits together. So as we go through the OAuth setup and the Passport setup, I will do my darndest to make sure that it's really clear what every line of code we're adding is doing inside this flow. But if you ever feel like you really don't have a good sense of the big picture, hey, that's totally fine. Again, very common complaint, something that a lot of people end up saying about Passport. Now, the second big issue with Passport is just the inherent confusion in how the library is structured. So let me tell you exactly what I mean by that. Up to this point, inside this video, so for like the last minute and a half, I've been saying just Passport, Passport, Passport over and over again. But in reality, when we make use of Passport, we are actually installing at least two different libraries. So let's talk about what those two libraries are. Okay, so on this diagram, it has two kind of like things on it. We're just focused on the one on the left right now, so just ignore the stuff on the right. So when we make use of Passport, we are actually installing at least two separate libraries. The first library is called just Passport. That's all. It's just called Passport. The core Passport library, or the core Passport module, is a set of very general functions and objects and helpers that make authentication work nicely inside of Express. So some very generic logic that can handle the idea of authentication with Express. To actually implement an authentication flow with a very specific provider, however, and when I say provider, I mean like specifically authentication with Google, or with email password, or with Facebook, or GitHub, or whoever else, we install what are called Passport strategies. So there's many different strategies out in the world, and each individual strategy helps you set up authentication with one very specific provider. So this is point of confusion number 2 with Passport, understanding what you're actually installing. You always install the base Passport module, and then you also install at least one Passport strategy that will help you handle authentication with one specific provider. Now, if you want to do multiple types of authentication inside of your application, if you want to have authentication with Google and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, that's totally fine. It just means that you're going to install 4 separate strategies and wire all those up inside of your application as well. For our app, we're only handling sign up with Google, so we are going to be installing exactly one Passport strategy. Okay, so overall, that's the two big complaints, or kind of the two big like warning signs I'm going to put out there for you with Passport. So warning number 1 is sometimes it feels like we don't have a good sense of the overall flow of Passport. And then warning number 2 is that we always have to install at least one of these strategies and hook it up inside of our application. Now, before we close this out, very quickly, I want to pull out the Passport documentation and just let you take a quick glance at it. And I bet you might get a sense of these 2 complaints that I've spoken about inside of here. So in a new browser tab, I'm going to do a search for Passport.js. And then we'll click on, hopefully, the first link that pops up, which is passport.js.org. Now, when you come here, you're going to immediately see the word strategies all over the place. So you see strategies, strategies, and then scroll down a little bit and blah, 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 strategies, just all over the place, strategies. So remember, a strategy is a module that helps you authenticate with one very specific provider. So let's first take a look at the documentation page. So you can click on documentation over here, and you get this just kind of like very general, basic overview on what Passport's doing for you. You know, if you want to, feel free to read through this stuff, but I kind of feel like you will agree with me that it feels like it's not really giving you the overall picture of what's going on. You know, I don't really see any diagram here that says, hey, here's like the very broad overview of exactly what's happening in very straightforward language. Now, the first paragraph on here, it does give you like, you know, some reasonable idea of what's going on, but again, I feel like it's just not super clear. Now, the other thing I want to show you very quickly is the strategies page. So if we go to strategies, you can see a list of all the different providers or all the different strategies that you can hook up to Passport. So looking through here, like here's Passport Spotify. So doing OAuth through Spotify. So we can click on the strategy and it will take us to a GitHub repository that gives us some documentation or some idea of how to handle Passport authentication with Spotify. And so when we finish this course, or when we finish wiring up Passport authentication, you absolutely could come back through and wire up Passport Spotify just as easily, and then allow your users to sign up with Spotify as well. So when we go through the Google stuff, it's going to be very similar to how Spotify works and how Facebook and LinkedIn and all these other providers work as well. So really, we're going to focus on this one Google provider, and then you, in theory, should be able to easily come back and add in other providers if you want to. Okay, so I think that's enough talking about Passport for this section. Let's continue into the next section, and we're going to install Passport and start to wire it up inside of our application. So I'll see you in just a second.